Hey guys, it's Bob Moriali here, and today I have Jeff Racer with me. He's from Full Race, and if you guys don't know who Full Race is, they are basically all about turbos. They are the #1 distributor of Borg Warner turbos for performance turbos here in America. So Jeff, thank you for joining me today, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bob.
No worries. You may not say that when I'm done with the next 10 or so questions, because we asked all the guys out on Facebook, what do you want us to ask and grill the experts on? So, hey, listen, I'm just the messenger, so don't shoot me.
I'm up for the challenge.
All right, man. All right. So, #1, and this is a loaded question. I'm sure this is going to go back and forth a lot once we get this out there. Why go turbo over other power adders such as a supercharger?
I think most people know that turbos are everywhere. So whether it's a dump truck or an excavator, a generator, a giant vessel going across the ocean, turbochargers are used because they efficiently scavenge the exhaust energy that would otherwise just be wasted out the tailpipe, and they're turning that into compressed air. A supercharger is being powered by a belt, which is driven by the crankshaft. So that's a parasitic loss, and it's not able to scavenge the exhaust energy. So it's a little bit more energy wasted in a supercharger application. But turbochargers are becoming very popular because every automaker has to reach very tight fuel economy goals. And there's really 3 ways to do it. You have an electric car, you have hybrid electric cars, and then there's going to be turbocharged cars. Superchargers are really just not getting it done. Naturally aspirated cars are not really getting it done with good power. They're either very slow in order to get the good fuel economy. So if you want a fun-to-drive car that burns fuel, it's probably going to have a turbocharger on it. And right now, we see 1 out of 4 cars produced has a turbo on it.
Wow.
By the year 2020, it's going to be about 3 out of 4 cars will be turbocharged.
Wow, so it's really going that way.
Yeah, 98% of BMWs will be turbocharged by the end of 2018. So it's either you're going to get a slow NA car or a hybrid electric car.
Nobody wants that.
Turbocharged car.
That's fact.
Nobody paying attention to this.
No.
And Borg Warner, actually, they make 12.5 million turbos every year.
Wow.
That's a lot of turbochargers.
That's a lot of turbos. All I want's 1.
Or 2.
Or 2. It depends on the combo, but yeah, probably 2. And would you say that we've come a long way to the point that if you're driving a really laggy turbo car, you did something wrong?
Well, I mean, I'm not a fan of lag, and I know that a lot of these aftermarket kits you'll see available may be a little laggy, but I think for drag racers, if you're a drag racer, you're on boost at 5,000 RPM from launch till the quarter mile.
Yep.
You are not out of boost at any point.
Right.
They don't care what happens before 5,000 RPM. So for a drag racer, lag is part of the deal.
Sure. And that's what Nitrous is for, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. A lot of people have this fantasy of, well, I want to street drive this drag car. And I think a lot of people get so caught up in the forum banter with dyno charts and comparisons that they forget about what it means to have a fun-to-drive car.
Yeah.
And I feel like the NA V8 crowd is a really good case in point, because naturally aspirated V8 motors, when they're tuned well, are a lot of fun to drive.
Absolutely.
You take a 4-cylinder with a big turbo, and even though it might make a lot of power on paper, it's not that much fun to drive unless it really is
in
technically
boost all the time.
on point.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of people have lost track, is you can't measure fun.
Right.
You know, there's dyno charts and there's boost plots and logs and all these things, but at the end of the day, what is more fun to drive? And it's the car that doesn't have the turbo lag.
Yeah, I was going to say torque. I think that for me is what answers my question, is when's the torque come in?
Agree.
Because we have guys that rent our dynos all the time, and they end up, making 600 to the wheels, but it's from 5,000 to 8,000 RPM. And is that okay on the drag strip with a big converter? Probably. Is it going to be fun stoplight to stoplight? No, it's going to be a turd. And you're going to get walked by a Nissan Maxima with a CVT transmission.
Boost is torque.
Yeah.
When boost comes up, torque comes up. When boost levels off, torque levels off. And when boost drops, torque drops.
Yep, absolutely.
And horsepower is just a function of that. And I think a lot of people get so caught up in this horsepower game, they don't realize that really, like you said, it's the torque that matters.
Absolutely. You want a nice steep torque curve. Gets that thing moving.
And just flat. Once it comes up, get to your boost level, just hold flat for as long as it really can.
Yeah.
And of course, that doesn't, the perfect situation like that doesn't exist. So we have to have compromise based off of all the factors: the size of the engine, the RPM range that we're targeting, the fuel used, and you do the best you can from that.
That actually kind of leads me into my next question, because one of the guys on Facebook, we asked, or on Facebook, hey, what questions would you like. One of them was twins or single. What's better and why in terms of turbos?
Well, if it's a V motor, twins all day, every day.
Okay, I'm actually surprised you say that.
The only reason to go single is if there's a packaging issue where you just don't have the room for twins.
Okay.
In my experience, twins are usually the same price and sometimes can be less expensive than a giant single.
Okay.
The twins will spool faster. They'll probably make similar or the same top end. In some cases, they might make more. On an inline motor, you can really go both ways. Twins and singles make sense. But we really learned this lesson from IndyCar. And I'm a single guy. If you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said single.
Sure.
But when you really get the experience and you see what the things are doing, it shows that twins have a big advantage. And IndyCar was a case in point. The Chevy teams were running 2 twin EFRs, smaller ones, whereas the Honda teams were running 1 very large EFR.
Okay.
So it was twins for Chevy, singles for Honda. Same 2.2 liter V6s, but the guys on the twins were running circles around the guys on the singles in the small tracks.
Sure.
You put them on the big track, Honda actually had better aero on their cars. So Honda was very competitive on the big tracks, and they won at Indy, and they did well. But as soon as they could, as soon as the rule revision came up in 2 years, Honda said, "Oh, please put us on twins. We all have to be on twins."
Yep. That makes perfect sense. And kind of leads to the next question, is the front mount versus rear mount debate.
Yeah, I understand that there is a debate for some people, but there's no debate for me. And,
Okay.
Most of the people that I know, there's absolutely zero reason to put a turbo in the back of a car. The turbo should be located very close to the engine. We have a runner and a manifold, but you want the turbo close to the engine, and then if there's a catalytic converter, you want that close to the turbo. But to have the turbo in the back of the engine after the catalytic converter, it's a terrible design. It has very long charge pipes, oil lines. Everything about it, intake is crammed back there. It's dirty air kind of where it's picking up. There's so many negatives to a rear mount turbo that I will absolutely never put my name on any.
So you wouldn't be a fan is what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying.
That's in a nutshell. That's where you're going with that.
I would go supercharger before I would go rear mount.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it.
I'm not a supercharger guy.
And you're not a supercharger guy, because I'm a turbo guy. I have actually supercharged cars here, so I shouldn't say that. But for me in the beginning, it was always turbo. And I'm kind of surprised you said that. But is it more of a reliability issue, or is it a lag issue, or what do you think?
It's an everything issue.
Okay.
Everything is compromised when the turbo goes back there. The reliability is compromised. The lag is increased. The pressure drops are increased. The losses are increased. The amount of plumbing that has to go from front to back on a 15-foot long car.
Yeah, it's big.
You know, that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, we have one here that we've played with for years, and it's good on the dyno. It makes great power on the drag strip. It does well, but I think it has its limitations. It's like you said, it's never going to be an all-out drag race setup. But I think that's people buy them would really be for the purpose of they want to bolt on a kit in the week, their weekend car, and just go stoplight to stoplight and enjoy boost.
So on a V8 engine, which is what we're going to talk about today, that's a really interesting area to me because V8s are very difficult to turbocharge properly. You have a big V when you have frame rails right next to each other, so you don't have the room for the turbo
plumbing.
and the manifold and the wastegate. All these components just can't really fit.
Sure.
And that's why rear mount makes sense for these people because they're like, hey, I'm turbocharging this thing. That's cool.
Sure.
But in the process of doing it, you're losing all the nuances and the kind of the special things you can do with turbocharging because you're putting the turbo on the back.
So it kind of sounds to me like it's the equivalent of bolting a supercharger kit on a weekend. It may not be the very best thing you can get. But it's
so
not.
That's why Full Race doesn't have a big presence in the V8 market, and that's why we don't make a lot of V8 turbo kits because if you're going to do a turbo kit on a V8 properly, you got to be a badass. You got to relocate stuff and put 2 turbos up front. The way that Full Race does it is it's going to be textbook.
Yeah. And
a lot of people who are looking for kits aren't willing to do that, and whereas the people who are willing to do that aren't necessarily looking for kits.
Correct.
They could make it themselves. So what we specialize in is we specialize in applications where we can do it perfectly.
Yeah. Well, and that makes sense.
The EcoBoost V6 was a case in point. I actually had a single turbo on our EcoBoost F-150 for a little while. And it sounded like it would be cool on paper. It looked good, and in reality, it just was not good. So I had a 550 horsepower single turbo. I pulled it off, and I put 800 horsepower capable twin turbos on it. Night and day better.
Yeah.
And the twin just blew the single out of the water.
Yeah. It's spool up time, turbo on, and...
Yeah, even though they're way bigger turbos.
It makes sense.
The twins destroyed the single in every regard.
Well, let me ask you kind of moving to the next subject of the frame design or whatever you want to call it, to, you know, the T2, T3, T4,
basically
V-bands.
There's exactly, it's T2, T3, T4, T6.
Okay, I hadn't even thought
Those
about
are the frames that are really kind of common. Garrett made that kind of a thing, and Borg Warner reinforced it, and then the aftermarket came on, and there's a lot of different companies making different turbos, but all of them ultimately have the same, they call it a footprint, or a foot design, or frame design as you called it. So T2s are the smallest.
Okay.
T3s are kind of the middle of the road. T4s are typically the larger frame, mid-frame.
Okay.
T4 would be mid-frame, and T6 would be large frame.
Like 100 millimeter turbo, probably a T6.
Yeah, exactly. Some giant drag racer, 88 and up type stuff, or 80 and up.
So big
That's
stuff.
usually the T6. So I say T2 is good to about 450, 500 max per turbo.
Mm-hmm.
T3s somewhere up to, you could probably make 650, 700. I mean, there's some guys who will make more, but
sure. But
per turbo. And then T4 will go to like 1,000 to turbo, maybe 1,100 a turbo.
Okay. So it's your street outlaw kind of guys.
Yeah, T6 will get into the 1,500, 1,800 horsepower per turbo.
The big stuff.
Yeah, gargantuan.
So, all right, so let me hit you with a confusing one then. All right, let's say I'm on the internet, like we never are, and people are bragging about their, you know, killer new combo 64, 66. I mean, they're throwing numbers out left and right. I'm looking at it logically going, is one side 64 millimeters? Like, what is the, what's the actual nomenclature? What's the
right way to do it is to just measure the outer diameter. So I have a turbo right here. I'll give you an example of.
Yep.
So here is a turbo.
Okay.
You'll see that there is what's called the inducer, which is the small end of the compressor wheel, and the exducer, which is the outer diameter of the compressor wheel. And the real right way to do it is to reference turbos by the outside of the turbine wheel.
Okay.
So that's the compressor exducer, and then the outside of the, the compressor exducer, but it's the turbine inducer, so just the largest diameter. So Garrett and Borg Warner will do that. Just you measure the large end of the wheels.
Okay.
Because when a wheel is made, they just cut it down to a percentage from the OD to the
ID.
inducer.
So really those numbers are supposed to mean, if they say I have a 64, 66 turbo, they're really referring to the inducer and the exducer size relative to one another.
So they are referring to the small end of the compressor wheel that's already been trimmed down, and the small end of the turbine wheel that's already been trimmed down.
Wow. Okay. Yep. I got
So
that
what
now.
I'm saying you want to measure is the part that hasn't been trimmed.
Okay.
Because that's actually the size of the wheel. How they machine it is the trim. So a case in point, this is a Mustang EcoBoost, so a 2015 Mustang EcoBoost turbo.
Okay.
It's a 62 millimeter OD. And I think it's like a 51 or something on the ID.
Yep.
All that 51 is a percentage of a 62. That's a trim percent. So maybe they trimmed it 70% to get it down to, I don't even know off the top of my head. But what I'm saying is when you just said, so a 64 or 62 or whatever it is, precision, or turbonetics, whoever it is, they're just measuring this.
Okay.
And the reason they're measuring that is the aftermarket kind of made their own nomenclature. And I think it had to do with some racing rules, but truthfully, it's just not the right way to call out turbos in my experience. And you're going to see some new releases of turbos that are going to blow all this stuff out of the water in a couple of years. As aerodynamics is improving, I'm privy to what the next generation of turbos are going to look like. And the way they're measuring these might become more clear at that point.
Okay. That's cool. So I guess that leads me to my next question then, because it's kind of the future, I think. But journal versus ball bearing in terms of bearing design.
Ball bearings definitely have an advantage, and it is in transient response. So like I was talking about with a drag car, when you're on boost from launch till the end, the ball bearing does absolutely nothing.
Right.
All a ball bearing does is allows you to get into boost.
So like a road race car would be better off with a ball bearing.
Really, a street car is a great case in point. But I mean, any time where you're out of lag, or you're out of boost, and then you're into boost, that lag period is going to be, it's just, the ball bearings work a little bit better like that.
So transient meaning it'll spin up faster.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the biggest differentiation, though, is a ball bearing, a proper ball bearing, is much more durable than a journal bearing.
Okay.
Just lifetime reliability. They take way less oil to keep alive. They have less wear. They're not susceptible to thrust loads if the blow-off valve is missing or sprung too stiff. Ball bearings just take it, whereas a journal bearing will see some wear over time.
Actually makes sense, because I had a vehicle here we used to teach on. It was a turbocharged Mustang 3-valve, and it was a ball bearing turbo. It was our first ball bearing turbo because we've always had journal bearing turbos in the past, and I did not know any better, and I ended up over oiling it, and I think what ended up happening was it would literally smoke just sitting at idle. It would just push. I think it was just pushing oil past what it really needed. Put a little reducer on it, and it cleaned right up. Is that so? That's
normal? Actually a really good point. If that's happening, I've even done that in the past, but I've over the years learned that's not the right solution.
Oh, okay.
What you want to do is actually put a bigger return on it.
Really?
Rather
So drain
than make
it
the
faster.
feed smaller,
Okay.
make the return bigger.
Okay, hadn't thought of that.
And then you want to vent your crankcase more. So if it's pushing oil like that, by reducing the oil into it, you're actually just, it may or may not work. I mean, typically it will work, but you are taking oil away from the turbo.
Sure.
And rather than take oil away before the turbo, it's better to take the oil away after the turbo.
Okay, so when I inquired about it, the guys I had asked, obviously we're not that privy to it, but they said, yeah, you're overfeeding it. The ball bearings don't need as much. So that was the theory, restrict the inlet. But you're saying drain it better.
Yeah, and restrict as a last resort.
I understand. That makes sense.
If you bumped it up to a 12 AN and you have big catch cans and everything is in order and it's still pushing oil, okay, then maybe
We're just overfeeding it,
but
sure.
A lot of people just go, oh, it needs a restrictor right off the bat.
Right.
When that's not the right solution. All it's going to do is pull oil away.
Okay, well, that makes perfect sense. I'm glad I asked that because I'm sure I'll run into that in the future too. All right, let's talk about wastegates for a little bit. Internal versus external. Let's just start with that.
For a street car, I really like internal wastegates. They make a lot of sense. They don't have dump tubes and V-bands and flanges and clamps and all the stuff that goes along with them. They're real simple. For a race car, external makes a lot of sense. And ultimately, it comes down to space because an internal can sometimes be easier or sometimes be more difficult to fit.
Okay.
Every single application and engine is going to be kind of different and unique, and where the turbo sits is going to be different and unique.
Packaging.
Yeah, obviously a rear-mounted turbo, you have quite a bit of room because people put the turbos where the mufflers went. And that's the ease and the attractiveness of something like that. But ideally, I would love to put a nice, internally wastegated turbo up front, but in a V8 application, it's just not going to fit.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of just kind of, I guess they call it tribal knowledge and experience required to get to the point where you can just look at a car and there's no way to replace taking this turbo and putting it in the car.
So why, if you had the option, you could do either. What's the benefit of doing an external over an internal or the other way around?
An external, it's the way they function. So an external wastegate, every wastegate has a section that's going to leak.
Okay.
An external will leak on the open side.
Okay.
An internal will leak on the closed side. So what that means is you can keep your external slammed shut, whereas it's more difficult to keep an internal slammed shut.
Which means
on
you
the
will lose
opposite
boost.
side, it's easier to open an internal, and it's more difficult to open an external. In the perfect world, there would be no wastegates because a wastegate actually means it's wasting energy.
Sure.
You're taking energy and you're bypassing it around the turbo. You're not going through the turbo.
Sure.
And there's no reason we should be wasting energy. We should take every ounce of energy produced by this engine and use it to make more power.
Sure.
But it doesn't work that way because
you'd overspin.
We'd either overspeed the wastegates or we'd create too much back pressure or we'd have very laggy turbos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes
sense. And in order to get spool up, you have to have a wastegate to keep everything in check. So, and that's part of the reason that drag racing turbos, like I said, you should have lag if you're a competitive drag racer because it means that you're not wastegating. A lot of people think, I want to make all this horsepower, I need giant wastegates. Well, no. The name of the game for me is that you want the smallest wastegate possible. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a limit to that, and there is a possibility of going too small on the wastegate.
Sure.
But the reduced amount of waste energy, the higher the amount of energy that's going through the turbo.
So you're talking efficiency, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. So how does an exhaust housing size play into the big picture here? Because we're talking about all this.
That's a big question, and it has a lot to do with every turbo. So first of all, as I mentioned, you got to decide where the turbo is going to go, and you got to decide, is it going to be internally wastegated or externally wastegated, and is it journal bearing or ball bearing? Because all these factors play in. You can't just get whatever you want. You have to figure out what's available, what fits my budget, where are we going to put the turbo, and how it's going to be wastegated. That all plays into this turbine housing question. So The larger the ARs, as we all know, it's going to spool a little bit later, and the smaller the ARs will spool earlier and have less top end.
Define AR.
AR is area over radius. So here is a turbine housing.
Okay.
The area is this here, the size of that circle. And the radius is the distance from the middle of this circle to the middle of this. It's called the volume.
Okay.
And so it's just a ratio of how far this is versus how big this is.
Okay. So
and
that's...
AR ratio is how most housings are measured. Now, some companies like MHI, Mitsubishi, they'll measure it in centimeters squared for area. And they'll just do an A measurement, but A divided by R is how most
for an AR ratio. So 0.82, 0.68, something
1.0.
Like
so on paper, a 1.0 is kind of numerically the optimal balance. As you go up in AR, it will flow more at less efficiency.
Right, okay.
As you go down in AR, it flows less at more efficiency.
Okay.
So just like everything else, there's
a trade.
There's a trade-off. So you can make more power by putting a larger AR on, but it's diminishing returns, and your turbine efficiency will suffer. And I kind of I use this program. I guess we'll get into it in a little while with Borg Warner. They have a web page called Matchbot.
Yes.
And what you can do is you can actually input your application with your displacement, all these things, and it will give you an output telling you what your, as called drive pressure, so back pressure. The pressure, you have your boost pressure. That's your pressure in your intake manifold. Well, the pressure in the exhaust manifold is very important, and not many people know it or how to monitor it.
That's a very good point.
And even if they did know, they still wouldn't do it because it's difficult and it's somewhat expensive. So what I like to do is use the Matchbot software because it gets us in the zone on the drive pressures. And then we can go back to a car and really test and solve, set up map sensors with canisters to separate the heat from the sensor. But you want to see, ideally, say we're running 30 pounds of boost or 20 pounds of boost in the intake manifold, we want to see the same amount of pressure in the exhaust as the intake manifold.
Okay. All right, so you're seeing a balance is what you're referring to.
Exactly. So it would be a 1-to-1 ratio or better. Say you had 20 pounds in the intake and 18 in the exhaust. That means you're blowing fresh air through the motor all the time. Now, the opposite, if you had 20 pounds in the intake but 30 in the exhaust, you'd be blowing exhaust back into the motor.
That's so funny you say that because I actually have had a car do that with 2 small turbos. They were tiny. A customer brought it in, and I think once we got over about 4 pounds of boost, that's exactly what happened. And it would literally choke the motor.
Yeah, so that's a strong reversion where the unburned hydrocarbons and all this exhaust gas, when the exhaust valve closed, it didn't leave the pit cylinder. It stayed in the cylinder.
We actually found it by putting a pressure gauge into an O2 bung that we had welded in the exhaust, just like you had said. Of course, we didn't know exactly what we were doing at the time. However, we realized afterwards that was definitely a good measurement to figure out that there was way too much back pressure in the system.
Well, where you want to measure it is before the turbo.
Yeah, we did that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we did that for sure, but that was our theory, was that there's some side of a bottleneck here that's not a good thing. Yeah,
exactly. That can definitely...
You know what we'll do is we'll go ahead and highlight that MakerBot, is that what it's called? Matchbot. MakerBot. No, Matchbot. We'll go ahead and highlight in the next video we'll do on turbochargers. So in the next video we'll do on turbochargers, we'll go through how to correctly size the turbo, how to do some math, airflow, things like that for engine performance goals, how to read the turbo compressor map, how to end up picking the right turbo. So we'll go ahead and plug that into our next video, our next Tech Tuesday video on turbochargers. That'll be part 2 on the turbocharger series. But before we end this one, we have one more question for you here, and the question is really, and I don't know how well we covered this, but boost creep in relation to the whole system. Like, why are we seeing some systems with boost creep as a persistent problem?
Boost creep means that when the wastegate's opening, it's not wasting enough energy.
Can't flow enough.
There are usually 2 main reasons for it. Reason number 1 is that the system was fabricated poorly or designed poorly.
Okay.
I've seen that many times. If there is a 90-degree bend before the wastegate, air doesn't like to make 90s, so it's just going to bypass that hole.
Sure.
And you really know you have a boost creep problem when you actually take the wastegate off. So there's no wastegate at all, and the engine will still build quite a bit of boost.
That's crazy to me. But I've seen that.
I've seen it.
Yeah. I've seen people put wastegates on at a 90. It's insane.
Yeah, they could take their wastegate off, and it might not even make a difference.
Not do a darn thing.
It's pretty amazing. So it means basically the wastegate could be oversized. You could make it bigger, or you could improve the flow to it. Instead of being on 90, you could put it on 45 or 20 or 30.
Sure. Actually, go ahead, buddy. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that the boost controller aspect and the spring is going to play right into that, because if you have too soft of a wastegate spring, it can act as if there's no spring. If you can have too stiff of a wastegate spring, it can cause overboost.
Sure.
So there's a lot that has to do with it, and the boost controller will take whatever your base spring pressure is, and it can go up from there.
Correct.
You can't ever go below where the wastegate is set up.
Right. That makes sense. And we actually had similar problems with that on our rear-mounted Trans Am, controlling it properly with the spring and we had an electronic boost controller, but we've always struggled to get the boost right where we wanted it. But I've often wondered, is it an issue of wastegate design, wastegate location, or just the whole system being where it is?
Yeah, on the rear-mounted systems, because there's so much volume from the headers to the exhaust all the way, it takes quite a bit of time and system lag to fill this. It's like a balloon pushing the turbo, and the thing's getting smaller and bigger and smaller and bigger. And that's just one of the compromises with the rear-mounted turbos that you're going to experience.
That makes sense. On a front-mounted turbo, I suspect you probably wouldn't quite see as much of the lag time between what's going on with the wastegate and what's actually happening.
Yeah, it's much more responsive.
Okay, well, that makes perfect sense then. I think that pretty well covers our questions for the first video we have here on turbochargers. And like I said, our next video we'll be chatting with Jeff again, and we'll be talking about how to correctly size a turbocharger. We'll be doing some math. We'll be using the website that he was talking about, and Matchbot, and then we'll go ahead and read the compressor map, teach you guys how to do that properly, and then from there pick a comparable or correct turbo. We'll be using our 5-liter Mustang as the example, and we're actually going to go through the site and pick and choose exactly, so we can see exactly what kind of turbo we'd end up with, doing it the right way, not just guessing.
Well, there's going to be some guessing involved.
Oh, well, minor guessing. We're guys. There's always going to be some guessing. Come on.
But we're still doing it the right way.
But we're doing it the right way, absolutely. We're going to do that on the next video. But thanks for chatting with us today, Jeff. We appreciate it very much.
Cool. Talk to you soon, man.
All right, buddy. Thank you.
Thanks.